Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for responding to our invitation on this press conference on foreign policy. I'm delighted to have members of the foreign media here. I would like to introduce the main lines of my project to renovate the outreach of France and put us back in place in among the nations. Before I make my address, I would like to talk about the intellectual and historic situation of France, because France is a nation different from others. Which elements enabled Charles de Gaulle to declare in 1941 in London that there is a pact that is 10 times bigger than France and the greatness of the world? It has a great deal of meaning, this sentence. Why would the freedom of the world require the greatness of France? France, because the king. Why would France have a specific place in the world? Let's not forget that Jean-Paul II, in his address in 1980 at Le Bourget, did not say France, big sister of the church. He said, great big sister of the church and teacher of the people. Are you faithful to man with the alliance and eternal wisdom? The Pope, a while ago, described France as a teacher of the people. Would the Holy See dare to describe France in thus today? However, objectively, this is what France was. Let's think of Romain Gary, whose Russian mother loved France and transferred her love of this country to her son. Why do we often love France more abroad than in France itself? Why does our civilization is our civilization known all over the continents? French diplomats and young people even ask this question. To be honest, I think that France is an inheritor of all of these components: Christianity, humanism, and enlightenment. And the role of France in the Council of Nations is part of this, or result of this. If we are made up of centuries of glorious history, we are moved by no amount of nostalgia. Everyone remembers the address of Dominique de Villepin in 2003 at the Security Council of the United Nations in New York, presenting France as an old and ancient country on an ancient continent, as my continent, when he was talking about Europe. And we can also talk about the aggression perpetrated against the sovereign state, Iraq, of which we are still measuring the consequences of this decision. France then was absolutely right to oppose this. And I'm not forgetting either the criticism that emanated among the French population to say that this gave France as having a stance that was counter-American rather than talking about strategy. But I also noticed that the more we talk today about strategy in the field of foreign policy, the more we talk about strategic partnership and the more we talk about something vacuous and diplomatic marketing. We have only talked about strategy, and since our governments do not bring any soul or anything positive to our democracy, they just preserve democracy or they orientate the means used for it into bad purposes. France is on the continent, but it still also has a maritime inheritance and makes it a world power present on all oceans in the world, thanks to its overseas power, its marine or merchant marine, and its alliances. France is not just restricted to a community, it is worldwide through its geography, its history, its interests, and its loyalties. This is why France is not France without greatness. It is the first principle that has to underlie all of the actions, all of the strategies, and any initiative taken. France is not an average nation, but a great power that still means something. The second principle is the defense of the national interests, what is good, necessary, and useful to France. This idea is not narrow or selfish. It is natural to all countries, and it is the prerequisite for any diplomatic ongoing diplomacy. What does the alliance do? They accept a common end, and this goes through reciprocity. And the third element that I would put at the heart of my speech is the return of French diplomacy, independent, equidistant, and constant. These three pillars require development, further development. Independence is not this selfish stance of a country that is indifferent to other countries and what happens to them. It is the power or the engine of all of the business in the world. How can we be a player of peace in the world if we are dependent on areas that stop whatever we can do and remove any form of objectiveness? Independence is therefore the condition to any intermediation, to any decision-making, and to any enterprise. France can be useful to sorting out the ills of the world only and only if it is independent. This is a paradox that globalists don't really understand, but we, nationalists, see it as an eternal truth. And this will be one of the reasons why I will remove us from the command of NATO. The independence that is equidistant means that we can understand the world and understand the geopolitics of nations without condemning them right from the beginning. France is the inheritor of 1,000 years of military and diplomatic tradition, intellectual and cultural. Constance, therefore, is of rigor. Constance in choices of a multipolar world, in commitments also towards countries such as Lebanon and communities such as the Christians of the Orient and some people such as the Jewish and Palestinian people. I am part of the Westphalian tradition balanced between sovereign states and the tradition of 1815 of integrating France in the European Association and the Association of Nations without trying to impose hegemony. Not because France would not have the means to not exercise hegemony, imperial, colonial, or linguistic, or commercial, but because in the end this does not correspond today to its end purpose. To be full, I will remain with secret diplomatic relations because they are the ones that are efficient. Open and talkative diplomacy of Emmanuel Macron, I would substitute silence and confidentiality. This will mean reforming methods, resources, and levers of the French diplomacy does not use enough. That is not, and France's diplomacy is too loud and not discreet enough. Now, how will I restore France in the Association of Nations if French people elect me on the 24th of April next, without, of course, giving up multilateralism? I will insist on deepening bilateralism. Today, too neglected to the profit or to the benefit of multilateralism, it has to be at the heart of our diplomatic activities. During the Conference of Ambassadors of August 2019, President Macron quite rightly noted that the Quai d'Orsay had to reinvest in bilateral work because he said he was struck to see that Europe had been left to the specialists. This meant actually that it was left to technocrats of European federalism to the detriment of our bilateral relations with other European countries. But his position was correct. He said that he had carried out 20 bilateral journeys in the European Union over the years, and he noticed that by visiting these countries, that these countries had not been visited by French presidents for 15 or 20 years. This was the case, actually, for Croatia and also for Serbia. He also recognized the fact that Germany had been far more efficient than we had during the last 15 years on this topic before calling to reinvest or restart new with a dialogue with Baltic states, the eastern countries, the group of Visegrad, the countries on the southern shores of the Mediterranean. I would like to strengthen this beginning of returning to our bilateral talks in Europe that had suffered from the alleged construction of Europe. Disconnected. I'm thinking of the countries that are already member states of Europe and also the Western Balkan states that we should not leave under the exclusive influence of the United States, of Russia, of Turkey, and of Germany. In this returning to bilateralism, I would like to illustrate my project through the mentioning of several of the countries with which France has privileged relationships. the Levant. Lebanon is dear to my heart and will always be one of my priorities. I will not, of course, come back to the links that unite us, that everyone knows, before the support of Napoleon III to the Maronites and then the mandate of the Society of Nations. I would like to come back to the support that President Macron tried to bring it in without success and in difficult conditions. But I think that the solution also goes via being clearer with Israel, with the United States, with Russia, with Iran, and the price that we attach to Lebanon and its sovereignty depend on this. We require Lebanon free for stability and the development of the Near East and the Arab world. The price that we attach to independence and stability of Lebanon do not reduce the friendship that we have with Israel. And quite the opposite, we are for a closening of the two states. And I affirm this with we're not being candid. Because, of course, these are issues that are very complex, but I'm saying this with force and determination. I'm not putting in talking about the instrumentalization of the Hezbollah by Iran that France cannot resolve on its own. This is why I think that the Lebanese question has to be systematically and more efficiently mentioned with our Israeli, Iranian, Russian, American, and Saudi relations, and with the Holy See. As for cultural purposes, as François Mitterrand used to say. I think it is an illusion to meet the Lebanese players, to talk to them when we know that the international context and foreign interfering does not allow us to do so. We are not trying to develop simple ideas, as General de Gaulle said in summer 1941, or rushing, as Emmanuel Macron tried to do so, even with such goodwill, without talking about how to talk about Levant, without talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I feel that it is just politically, historically, and morally, and I will remain faithful to the official line of the Quai d'Orsay, commitment of France in favor of a solution for two states. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict will not be able to be resolved. Will not be resolved by the creation of an independent, reliable, democratic state living alongside the other side, and the foundation of what was created in 1957 leads to a fair situation for refugees, and the solution will be in favor of Israel and Palestinian. France is pleading in favor of a separate state. Jerusalem, we feel, has to become the capital city of both states, whilst we are awaiting a negotiated sorting out of the conflict, and France does not recognize any sovereignty on Jerusalem. That is the end of the quote. I would like to also mention that the lines of 1967 are not intangible. If one day it seems that a bilateral agreement between Israelis and Palestinians could occur, then of course, and unfortunately, we are far from that situation. Everything that we can put in place to encourage such a link will be done by us. And in this respect, I can only be happy about the closeness that has happened recently between Israel and the Arab world. It seems to me that France, that holds simultaneously privileged links with the Arab world and with Israel, benefits from expertise and familiarity with the Levant that might have been pushed aside in the past, including by our American partners. It therefore belongs to Israelis, first of all, and Palestinians to resolve this conflict. The vocation of France is to encourage this resolution. Before we talk about the Northern Africa, a few words about the Arabic Peninsula. The Islamic activities have to be mentioned. I think that France is well placed to talk about this. The Emirates are countries, and Oman are countries that can be used to help with pursuing countries that are destabilizing the world. Let's also now talk about North Africa. I'd like to maintain and enrich our links with the three countries in North Africa. The Royal Kingdom of Morocco, that is dear to us, and also our current support in Tunisia to stabilize the situation if the Tunisian authorities require it. Because of a potential misunderstanding on my vision of France and Algeria, let me mention more specifically this country. Mr. Xavier de Driancourt, an expert and former ambassador in Algiers, declared recently that most of the French presidents newly elected, mainly Jacques Chirac, François Hollande, and then Emmanuel Macron, were attempting, to start with, to initiate a relationship perceived as special with a certain amount of enthusiasm, and then ended up coming up against the bilateral issues, memorial, visas, and the strong reticence from Algeria to implement a policy to readmit undesirable people living on the French soil. I would put in place the reverse policy, chronologically, and from a methodology point of view, but with the same purpose, to hold friendly relationships with Algeria, and accounting for the observations of the ambassador in his last book, who explained that Algerians understand and know French people very well, despite the fact that French people who think that they know Algeria have a skewed vision of what is happening and don't really understand anything about it. I'm not forgetting the observation under which Marseille is closer geographically to Paris and would not be part of the debate that consists in determining whether the Mediterranean should be perceived as a border between Europe and Africa, or a lake around which would be encouraged a civilization that aims at unity. Vis-à-vis Algeria, my hope, therefore, is from the beginning to set as a condition all handing out of visas to Algerian citizens, all transfer of funds, to all acquisition of own property in France by dignitaries from Algeria with different elements, and an effective putting in place of the readmission by the consular authorities in France, Algerian consular authorities in France. I think we need to start this right from the beginning, which none of my predecessors dared to do, and then to little by little build relationships between sovereign states from one to another, which seems to be more in the interest of Algeria and Algerians than it is in the interest of France. In the end, we are not dependent economically on Algeria, nor on gas from Algeria. It is mainly in the interest of Algeria that its relationships with France be healthy and appeased. I will repeat this, and without forgetting anything that happened in the past, because recognition of the past, of the glorious elements and the shadows, does not mean that repentance. I would like to develop friendly relationships with the Algerian people, because it's in our mutual interest, and because it is a question, in the end, that is more sentimental on either side rather than rational or economically essential and indispensable for France. The Algerians who already live in France and behave according to French law, respect our uses and customs, like France, its tradition, history, culture, who benefit from work contracts and enrich us with their know-how, which constitutes, of course, most of them, I believe, do not have any reason to not be invited to remain here. The others, in a minority, of course, will have to leave. And consular services in Algeria will have to deliver laissez-passer certificates to respect the sovereign decision of France and remove from its soil any foreigner that they deem to be undesirable, without criminal sentencing. Once elected, I will have an open stance with Algeria, and I think that our two countries have everything to win from it. I wish to adopt a policy that is comparable with, for example, the Comores. Let me move from the shores of the Mediterranean to the Rhine and Elbe. I would like to, in respect with Germany, dissipate any misunderstanding. If I have been able to rightly criticize strongly Mrs. Angela Merkel, because the energy and migratory policies, but also the discreet and careful hegemony in Europe was actually negative for Europe and for her own country, I would like to say that I do not nourish any hostility against the German nation. I am aware as much about the economic interdependence between France and Germany and the cultural influences and mutual civilization influences that we are not aware enough of in France, and that it was deemed to be necessary to remove from the history books in France after 1870. The fact, for example, that France have the Confederation of the Rhine, where France started unifying Germany even before Bismarck. Traditions in foreign policy in France and Germany differ often, and often Germans perceive France as too Jacobite, whereas French people do not understand that well German federalism. I do not believe that they are incompatible. If we are not seeking to set, without saying so, the German model on France via the Europe of regions or the building of great or major transborder regions. Each nation has its own genius, its political traditions and its territorial organization. And I will, as Adenauer, General Adenauer and de Gaulle said, and then Valéry Giscard d'Estaing and Helmut Schmidt, that we are forging reconciliation between Germany and France without following, of course, the Macron-Merkel blindness of France in regards Berlin. It is normal that Berlin defends its interests, that we defend our own interests, which is what President Macron did insufficiently well, and France and Germany not exclusively work towards the interests of the continent. I will not let Germany destroy the French nuclear industry, for example, and I will try to ensure that I can convince German partners, as the gas crisis shows, of the good model that we have in France, based mainly on nuclear power and hydroelectric power. This does not, of course, push out the cooperation between France and Germany in research and development on hydrogen or on new sources of energy, for example. You know my stance on the wind power scam. No need to come back to that, but I would like to underline that wind power does have many adversaries in Germany. In the field of defense now, Germany has diverging from ours. It is considered naturally it looks after its security, which leads it to buy American defense, ground, air, military combat planes, and it does not have a full military army. Pacific, because of its late rearmament that is just catching up because of underinvestment, it is condemning the export of weapons that it does not perceive as a prolongation of its diplomatic forces. Counter-nuclear or anti-nuclear, but paradoxically carrying out the nuclear program for NATO, it cannot remove the cornerstone of our defense. Patriotic, it pursues the defense of its interests in space, going from satellite shared capacity with France to a solution that is purely German in both areas, as it pursues it in programs that are collaborative and where its requirements in terms of governance and technology are reversely proportional to its weight, its investments, and to its steps forward. Germany, therefore, is the absolute negation of the French strategic ideology based on independence, dissuasion, and a model of army and full industrialization on a world rank. Let's look at these main basic differences that are irreconcilable. We will stop all cooperation with Berlin, combat planes, fighter planes, future tanks, to pursue our own programs to replace the Leclerc tank and the Rafale. I'll also stop support from France to the claim of Germany for a permanent seat on the Security Council of the United Nations. I, however, would like to nourish French-German friendship with several measures. One is the relaunch of learning German in schools, and also French teaching and secondary school teaching that has collapsed since the fall of the wall. In the context of the reinstalling of the Cadre d'Orient, the West, I will merge competitions and re-establish German in the external competition in the Central Europe and Eastern section. I'm thinking of the language, but also of German culture. I wish also to strengthen more concretely the use of German and French within European institutions that, and I'm apologize to say this, do not have a vocation to remain de facto or only exclusively English-speaking. This can only be done in agreement with the other member states, but the European Union has no purpose in being, or no interest in being English-speaking. Language is not just a technical aspect, it's also a very political subject that has an influence on the way of thinking nowadays. English-speaking engenders a neoliberal way of thinking often. And I'd like to strengthen further exchanges and partnerships between academics and scientists on either side of the Rhine. I wish to beef up the Office for Youth, Franco-German Office for Youth, and as opposed to its current way of doing things where they just carry out ridiculously unimportant activities. France and Germany know each other little, and Germany remains an exotic place to go to by French people. And so I wish to contribute to sorting this issue out and turning it around. Finally, on a trilateral plane, I would like to relaunch the Weimar Triangle with Poland that has been dormant pretty much since its creation in 91, which is a challenge in itself. Carrying on with our journey towards Asia Pacific, China is a very specific region and area, and I would like to base myself more on our academics and researchers, on all of our companies based there, and not just on Jean-Pierre Raffarin. A former ambassador to Beijing explained that the Beijing authorities only understood power, that we needed to deal exclusively on an equal-to-equal position, and that the French authorities did not actually always understand this. The culprit behavior of our leaders showed submission, including to attract Chinese tourists. It has to be stopped. We will contribute to getting international law respected, maritime law respected, including in areas of the globe where French power is present. We are power in Asia Pacific and Oceania through our ultramarine presence, military presence, through our national navy. We also we will develop our partnership with Japan, Korea, and various other countries. Through our ultramarine territories, with strengthened protection, we will consolidate our presence in Asia, Oceania, and we will not follow the Biden administration, which of course requires enemies to bring together its enemies under its domination, that I feel, without any polemic thought, too aggressive as regards Beijing. I say that we need equidistance. Once I am elected, I will maintain relations with Beijing, equal-to-equal relations within the respect of our sovereignty, and also in regions in Asia and Pacific where France is actually present. To illustrate my desire to renew with the bilateral experiment from the French diplomatic corps within the context of reaffirming the reach of France.
All right, you've been listening live there to the far-right candidate for the French presidency, Marine Le Pen, speaking here in Paris to lay out a little of her foreign policy programme. You heard her talk there about her plans for France's relations with Algeria, with Lebanon, with Germany. Notable, though, during the first 20 minutes of that speech or so, we didn't hear her talk about the war in Ukraine nor Russia.